just collaborate in that way. And I think people are joining us now.
Yeah.
I think we can get started. So I'm just going to say a few words and then hand it over to Don. So everyone here knows the principles. You don't know me though. My name is Chad Zimmerman. I'm the editor for Economics here at University of Chicago Press. And we are very fortunate to publish this new book by Margaret Schabas and Carl Wennerlind that you've all tuned in to hear about. The book is A Philosopher's Economist, and it is available wherever you buy your books, including, for those of you in Chicago, the Seminary Co-op, which has helped us to promote this event. So please, first and foremost, thank you for lending your time and attention to this and to its authors. And thank you to our very special guest, Don Garrett, for being here. I wanted just some housekeeping things. Most of you are being very quiet, which I appreciate. If you could please take a moment to mute your computers, that would be wonderful. If we get intervening noise during the course of this, I'll do my best to suss that out and quiet it. We've got some questions that we're going to talk about for the first 2/3 or so of the hour, and then we're going to open it up to questions from those of you who have tuned in. If you would, please put those questions in the chat feature, and I'll do my best to sort of aggregate them thematically when we get to the question portion. Otherwise, I'm just going to briefly introduce our guest here and then turn it over to Don. Margaret Schabas is professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia. She's the author of several earlier books, including Chicago's own book, The Natural Origins of Economics. She joins us from Vancouver. So hello, Margaret.
Hello, everyone.
Carl Wennerlind is professor of history at Barnard. His previous book is Casualties of Credit, and he joins us from what I presume to be Uptown, New York. Carl, hello, good afternoon.
In my office, they let me in.
Oh, very nice, good. And from the opposite end of Manhattan is the aforementioned Don Garrett. He is the Silver Professor of Philosophy at NYU and the author of several books on Hume and other topics in early modern philosophy, including most recently Nature and Nurture in Spinoza's Philosophy. So Don, thank you for being here and for everything, and I will turn it over to you and then mute myself.
Okay. Thank you, Chad, for the introduction and for organizing this event. Especially thank you, Margaret. Thanks to Margaret Schabas and Carl Wennerlind for writing this fascinating and illuminating book that we're going to be talking about. And thanks to all of you for coming to this event after its postponement last Tuesday, so that we could devote that day to teaching and reflection on issues related to racism. Sadly, and as many of you will know, Hume had his own relation to racism, as Margaret and Carl discuss in the book. So Carl and Margaret, first, please tell us about how this book came about. I know you previously co-edited a volume together. Now, how did you collaborate on this book? Did you each bring something different to it? How did that process work?
Well, I'll go ahead and start, Margaret, and then you can fill in the missing parts. So we met for the first time in 1999 at a meeting of the History Economics Society. Margaret had been a reviewer of a piece that I was trying to get published, and she did not reveal that she was the reviewer until much later. And we struck up a conversation that has really continued to this day. So we then decided to organize a conference at Barnard College that led to an edited volume on Hume's political economy. And then we were asked a couple of years later to write a piece for, thank you, for the Journal of Economic Literature or Economic Perspectives, which we also collaborated on. And every time we got together to talk about Hume and his political economy and its importance to Hume's endeavor in general, we just kept on seeing more and more interesting questions. And, we would pursue certain questions which would raise other questions. So there's just so much there. And both of us, I suppose, had our separate ideas about writing a monograph on Hume. But I think we bring a complementary set of skills to the project. We both have a background in economics, but I work in a history department as a historian now, and Margaret is, of course, working in a philosophy department. So having economics and history and philosophy and bringing those to bear on this project, we thought would be a good idea. So we then started, and I think this project goes back, I would say, almost 8 years or so, when we really started thinking about writing this. So we were responsible for separate parts, and I would say that those chapters were maybe concluded 3 years ago, and then we probably spent the better part of 3 years just working through these chapters and creating a coherent voice and making sure that it at least spoke to most of those questions that we've been grappling with during this period.
Thanks. I really admire the ability to co-author something. It's something I've never been able to do. So, as you emphasized, despite the fact that the book is called The Philosopher's Economist, Jim wouldn't have called himself an economist, since that term was not available in that sense to him. His most detailed contributions to economics were contained in a collection of essays he called Political Discourses, which, as you explained, was very popular in his lifetime. I didn't really realize how very popular it was until reading your book. This is the only one that he declared had been successful on its first publication. It's the only one he was pleased with the reception of at the outset. But he did consider politics to be a science. So how did he think of what we call economics in relation to that science of politics?
Okay, well, I'll answer that. We decided to just use the word economics to cover all the thousands and thousands of publications that you can find in early modern writings. Philosophers in particular, people may not know this, but Locke and Berkeley made important contributions to economics. And one can go on, Rousseau and Condorcet. So the early modern period is replete with economic thinking. And the term is there if you look for it, but it's true that we think Hume meant politics to include the science of commerce. That was his term. But we didn't think it would be easy to use that term today. People might not know what it denotes. So as a historian of science, we generally live and breathe in doing the history of physics or history of biology, going right back to the Greeks. We just decided it's just too complex to start parsing that term, and look rather, as I think Hume definitely did, that it's a set of phenomena, and he lists those very succinctly, that this is to cover, and many of them form, of course, the title of his chapters in the political discourses. But they're there even in the inquiry and the treatise. So he's interested in these questions of money and trade, population, contracts, and so forth. And these form, and for that matter, taxes. He's very interested in public finance. And all of that, I think, is there in his work. Mm-hmm. So we feel quite confident in imposing that very simplifying term to his work.
Sure. And he has a very broad sense of politics as a science. It just covers, considers men as united in society and dependent upon one another, which certainly includes
right, and that's
economics.
In the beginning of its treatise, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
He's going to write book 4 on politics,
Mm-hmm.
and we think that included for him all the kinds of issues surrounding trade and finance.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. So it's often debated whether there's a unifying thread to all of Hume's life and writings, reformation of the sciences, irreligion, or attack on organized religion. You mentioned a couple of those in the book, and then you make the bold claim that economics constitutes at least one unifying thread for all of Hume's work. It was a very striking claim because many people think of it as something he just did on the side for a moment. So you trace that from his early memoranda and his disastrous 6 months as a merchant's clerk in Bristol, right through to the end. So how does that work as a unifying thread? How does it fit into his best known philosophical works like the treatise and the inquiries?
Mm-hmm. Well, so we document in the book his constant and kind of enduring interest in observing economic phenomena, economic data, and economic patterns. And we believe that this is part and parcel of his conviction that the economy is really the kind of engine or fundamental mechanism that can generate progress and can generate improvement. And here we're not just talking about economic improvement, but also moral improvement. So like many other Enlightenment philosophers, this idea of improvement and progress was really central to his overall endeavor. We argue in the book that reason, religion, ideas is not enough to generate this kind of progress. And he argued that people really are what they do. So he put the spotlight on, in particular, the middling sorts or the middle classes, and the kind of activities that were involved in the quotidian life of a commercial subject. And he argued that partaking in, on a daily basis, industry, commerce, and the refinement of the arts and sciences, that these three activities, right, really serve as a kind of, as a moral or solvent, as a kind of, that it improves our capacity for reason, it improves our moral refinement, it makes us more disciplined, industrious, honest, more sociable, more benevolent, and that really becomes the foundation of the moral improvement part of his discussion. And then, of course, he certainly does not disregard the material improvements that comes from these activities. So the economic growth and the moral refinement are sort of are occurring in tandem through human history.
Thanks. You quote Robert Lucas as saying in his Nobel Prize lecture that Hume's work is, quote, the beginning of modern monetary theory. So for those who know Hume primarily as a philosopher, many people here, what did Lucas mean by that? And what are the contributions for which Hume is most celebrated in terms of economics?
So, I mean, he is most celebrated among 20th century, 21st century economists for his contributions to monetary theory. In fact, Milton Friedman acknowledged him as well. So Hume grapples with the complexity of money, and he has rather interesting insights into its representational or semiotic dimensions. He emphasizes that money is a convention. These are things he works out even in book 3 of the treatise. But what is so interesting about Hume is that he, well, first of all, broaches two fundamental principles. One is that in a very set of circumstances, limited circumstances, money can actually stimulate economic growth. And it does it almost through a kind of sleight of hand. It's a really interesting argument. And the other then is to emphasize the grand neutrality of money globally, that the specie flow mechanism that he articulates suggests that money will correlate with the balance of trade in any given nation. And the balance of trade is essentially a physical feature of our world. It's about, how much corn, say, one country exports and how much wine they import. And there's just going to be some net balance one way or the other. So in that respect, he's aware that the money is coding. He's very also clear about the nominal realism distinction that becomes so prevalent in mainstream economics by the time of, say, David Ricardo. So in that sense, he has a lot of really rich insights, but he also really, I think, one of his great contributions is the interest rate, which he argues is a non-pecuniary phenomenon, that it's really, again, correlated with people's dispositions for prudence and frugality in industry. It's essentially the key parameter to measure what we would call the capitalist engine. And he sees that and therefore strips it of its an initial correlation with the market of loanable funds. It's certainly true that the price or the interest rate will fluctuate given supply and demand conditions for loanable funds or given the quantity of money in a nation. But it's much more important to see it as correlated with the profit rate. And that means, therefore, the return on capital. That is a remarkable insight on his part.
Yeah, I think that the insight that an increase in the monetary supply stimulates growth through a kind of sleight of hand or failure of complete information. There anticipates the idea that if it's already widely known that it's going to occur, it doesn't have the same sort of effect. do you think Hume deserves to be celebrated for those things? Are those the things for which he most deserves to be celebrated? Are there other things that for which he is unappreciated but should be appreciated? Partly, of course, that's the question of the originality of his contributions to monetary theory, but also the question of whether there are other things that you think deserve more attention.
Well, I think, one can always debate, who came up with a particular idea first, and one can certainly do that with the specie flow mechanism, the quantitative theory of money, and there are certainly a lot of other people who are thinking in similar terms to Hume around the same time. But I think what Margaret and I were struck by in terms of the virtue of Hume's economics is just how wide and adaptable and capacious it is, and how it connects to his political thinking, his philosophy, his epistemology, really his whole system, how it all is connected to his economics, and therefore we get an extremely sort of rich understanding of the human subject that's involved in economic transactions. We get a very deep understanding of the historical patterns underlying the emergence of capitalism. We also get a really rich understanding of the institutions, so property markets and money, but also others, how they're constructed and how they fit together to create what Hume believed was this rather glorious trajectory of modern society. So I think this just reiterating what we are arguing, that really the most striking feature and I guess the most important part of our book is really to highlight this interconnection of his ideas and how the thread of economics is woven throughout that fabric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the most interesting aspects of the book to me was the way in which you draw links between his economic theories and his policy recommendations. He was particularly proud of his work in morals as one of the moral sciences, that is, in ethics as one of the moral sciences because of its practical value. And so you emphasize the way in which his contributions to the science of commerce and politics also have practical effects in making recommendations to decision makers. You mentioned a couple of those and whether you think they were good ones or not. He could have a good theory and make bad recommendations, I guess.
Yeah, I think this is also a very important part of his economics, that he is thinking of leaving his imprint on the world, and he has very many associations with the leading, particularly Scottish policy makers. And that, I think, is really the Duke of Argyll, who was known as the King of Scotland, is someone that Hume, well, he sent his political discourses to him, and he had acquaintances that were in the business commercial world of Scotland and helping to run Scotland. What Hume is most trying to do is achieve a peaceful world. He's very concerned about the wars that he sees and witnesses in his lifetime and the overarching tendency for political instability. And so he wants to ensure that governments are fiscally responsible. So he has a lot to say about the mounting public debt and the overissuance of bonds. He's concerned about taxation, draining particularly the laboring class. So he really advocates excise taxes. He wants to have gains from trade everywhere because he sees how these definitely stimulate growth. And so he wants to, as he says, he prays for France itself to become a nation at which they are not longer at war, but in peace. And I think it's really important to see that he has this global vision and he's thinking about how to forge a world of strong international, I hate to say free trade, but certainly more unrestricted trade. And to see that as an overarching policy. Now, the magistrates at the time could not do very much. They could be responsible in collecting taxes and so forth, ensuring contracts are honored in the courts. But he emphasizes the importance of stimulating population growth and suggests again that the rulers look to how one, and this is of course quite appropriate now, how you forge a healthy population. And he's aware that there are economic factors that are correlated with population cycles. So he's interested in that. And he gets into even fine-grained decisions that are made about the rearing and number of children one has. And that becomes quite a central proposition in classical political economy, not just with Malthus, but it's there with Ricardo and Mill as well. Everyone's concerned with how you can get high wages to stimulate a kind of responsible rate of reproduction that will feed the laboring class. But as long as you keep having that growth, you have, as Hume rightly recognized, aggregate demand increasing. That will then stimulate the production of more goods and will lead to a spilling over into international trade.
Does he have a sense that population growth can be too rapid? Or is it always a good thing for him? You mentioned a responsible rate of population growth, and I can't think of some place in which he cautions against too rapid growth in the population. But I don't know what the current status of people's views on that.
He knows that Spain is very empty because there aren't enough people. Locke had mentioned that obviously in the second treatise, and Locke thinks the world can absorb twice as many people. Obviously, we've gone well past that figure since 1900. We've probably gone fivefold, but I think they do believe that there's a lot more capacity in the world, although China, they believe, is saturated with people. So there is an example of the saturated state. Carl, do you want to dive in there?
Well, just in his essay in which he compares modernity and ancient nations, in particular on the basis of population growth and population numbers, it's very much framed as the happiest and most well-functioning country is the one that is going to have the largest population. So it didn't seem like he really had any sense of that ending anytime soon, and that he viewed this as a kind of litmus test or a way to gauge the success of different social organizations.
Okay, thanks. I think maybe if people know just one thing about Hume or think of Hume in one way as an economist, is that he was a forerunner of his young friend, Adam Smith. So how did Hume really influence Smith, and where did they differ?
Margaret, do you want to do that?
Okay. I think that, they have this close friendship for over 25 years, and they meet actually just before Hume issues the Political Discourses. And so there's reason to think perhaps that even Smith was engaging in some of that discussion, and certainly within a couple of weeks of its issuance, Smith gives lectures at the University of Glasgow on Hume's Political Discourses, which contain 12 essays, 9 of which are explicitly on economic subjects. So they're close friends from about 1750, and it's a complex relationship, but I think that there's certainly no dispute that Smith's first and I think greater book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was a direct response to Hume's work in moral philosophy, and a refinement, as say people like Sam Fleischacker have shown, of the fine-grained process of sympathy, that kind of mechanism. I think Smith takes up from Hume and then alters quite importantly. But in terms of economics, I think in the very broad brush sense, they're very similar in nominal real distinction, in the importance of population growth, and seeing the interest rate as a salient feature of their economic world, and looking at the complexities of paper monetary instruments, of which there are many at the time. They're concerned for the stability of the banks. They lived through a bank run, for example, and witnessed the devastations of that. So there's an awful lot that they share, but that's the macro view. If you go under the microscope, of course, there are important differences, and people have written on this. There have been debates since Jacob Viner about whether Smith really endorsed this BC flow mechanism and so forth. But as you well know, at the end of Hume's life, Smith is effusive of how important a thinker Hume was, and how much he cherished their close friendship.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Capitalism is another word that Hume doesn't use, but which also appears in your title. You write that Hume is an enthusiast for capitalism, even more so than Hume, indicating a sort of some range of degree of difference there. So did Hume think that capitalism was entirely good then?
Well, there is this sense that he believes that if society can be organized around these fundamental institutions of property, markets, and money, and that creates the proper incentives for people to engage in industry, commerce, and the refinement of the arts, that will, as I said before, sort of promote economic growth, promote higher standards of living, and also promote a moral refinement and just a more sociable society. He also makes the argument that with time, capitalism will also kind of pull back people's interest in bodily pleasures, consumptions, or various kinds of pampering, because he believed that as we become and acquire more social virtues, we also take a greater interest in the pleasures of the mind, so that we become more interested in conversation, in music, in a good poem, and that therefore sort of shaves off some of the rougher edges of capitalism. Now, what's very important to pinpoint here is that he didn't necessarily think that there was any kind of automaticity here that is necessarily going to generate all of these virtues, because people are constantly failing to uphold these institutions and fail to engage in these activities. And statesmen, even though he tried to educate them about good economics and how to marshal a commercial society, they had their own interest, and they therefore didn't listen to his advice about trade regulations, about the national debt, and instead used the institutions of capitalism, commerce, and the national debt to engage in even more warfare. So there's a sense, a theoretical possibility that a liberal commercial society can generate a Panglossian world, but because of all of these mechanisms not always working particularly well, there are failures along the way that distract or slow the progress that he envisioned. So it's an intricate clockwork, and he defines very elaborately how this clockwork can work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will.
Okay, so let me ask you a little bit more about that, either or both of you. Smith's most famous metaphor is surely the invisible hand of the market. You emphasized Hume's metaphor of an indissoluble chain between industry, knowledge, and humanity. So it sounds as though the chain might not be entirely indissoluble, or at least it can weaken. But I also like to hear you say more about the humanity part of that. It's people is view that not only does industry bring about knowledge, some of which you mentioned about, but also a greater degree of humanity.
Well, I'll start, and Carl, I'm sure, can add to that. I think one of the important things about Western Europe at the time was how urban it was. It urbanized it. 50% in a country like the Netherlands were already living in towns and villages. And I think for Hume, this creates a very important arena for people to learn to be more other regarding. I think he really does believe it creates politeness and civility, and that even to engage in trade does this. Mandeville captured this very well, how much flattery is involved in any kind of commercial transaction, and how it brings out this kind of perhaps veneer of human interaction, but one that is ultimately polishing, as Montesquieu called it, the du commerce argument that we get at the time. And of course, that also spills into peace. And the arguments for that are difficult at times. It doesn't seem to me to follow that trade will ensure peaceful relations. But Hume believes that if it cultivates enough tastes and dependencies, all things being equal, it's likely that people will prefer to engage peacefully with one another rather than to conquer and steal goods. And of course, the humanity comes out of the cultivation of knowledge. The people become more refined, and as Carl put it very well, they come to appreciate the non-pecuniary goods, friendship and poetry. Of course, he's here talking about the middle class more than the laborers, but even there, I think he grants them quite a lot more potential and capacity for making prudential decisions and perhaps finding ways to improve and elevate their standing. And I think Hume wants to see the relations between men and women evolve more in the future. So when he talks about past virtues like chastity and so forth, he thinks that these things are waning and that people will be, I think, more able to have a freer rapport and sexual relations, for example, than has hitherto been the case. Carl, why don't you say something?
Yeah, let me just add the one important ingredient in this relationship between industry, knowledge, and humanity. So certainly it has to do with industry, commerce, and the arts, but also it has to do with the development of a delicacy of taste. That it was important to Hume that as people's minds become more refined by partaking in all these activities, that they also pursued not just the technical and mechanical arts, but also the liberal arts, which meant reading philosophy, reading history, reading poetry, going to plays, theaters, music events, and that delicacy of taste will create a different type of sociability between people, and that as people meet in cities and at the theater, at the pleasure garden, or at the coffee shop, conducting their trades, there's a different transcript for how one behaves with other people that is much more about generosity, sociability, friendship, and benevolence, and that he believed that that was a very important ingredient in turning the economic machinery into something that polished the moral sentiments and created good habits and patterns.
So if one doesn't often hear nowadays the argument for capitalism as a force for increasing humanity and what Hume called politeness, if people would like to see an argument for that, Hume is a good place to look. I have just a couple more questions, but let me say before I ask those questions, if people want to start putting questions in the chat now to increase your chances of getting your question reviewed by Chad and answered, go ahead and do that. Or it may be that only Chad is getting them. But if you have a question, feel free to start typing it in now, I think. So the last couple of questions, I'd like to bring Hume up to the present. Particular, what did he foresee for the future of the British and world economies? What do you think would surprise him about how things have actually turned out?
Oh, that's a hard question. I mean, I think that Hume is an enthusiast for the capitalist world as an improvement on previous eras, but he also sees some of its fundamental weaknesses. One, the increasing tendency to public debt, the return to autocratic rule. So he thinks way in the future, it's quite likely that representative government will wane and undo itself, partly because of the problems of political factionalism. So there are a lot of concerns there that the system that he thinks and celebrates in his own time, he does think that he's living in a United Kingdom that is superior to any previous period, but he does look into the future, and he sometimes talks about 300 to 500 years into the future, even suggesting that those in the carriage and those who are the servants outside might change places because of the portability of financial instruments. But I think there are dark clouds there. I don't think Hume is we certainly don't want to suggest he's naive or innocent about the future. As you probably know, Smith in the last line of The Wealth of Nations speaks to the importance of Britain coming to terms with its genuine mediocrity. And I'm sure Hume discussed this with Smith, they know that the baton is already passing to America just as it becomes a nation, that they have, again, the best recorded rate of population growth of any region that they can cite. And, you know, there are a couple of times where Hume even suggests that China, because it's such a productive engine, could end up being the hegemonic power down the road. Especially he suggests if shipping costs can be brought down. And I guess you could say sometimes economists make good predictions. That's one of them. I'll stop there.
Well, let me just, so he had a very elaborate idea and theory about the relationship between rich countries and poor countries. So he's very concerned about what would happen to the rich countries. Would they be overtaken by the poorer ones? He posited this kind of benign globalization whereby technologies would migrate from the rich countries to the poor countries, and that would enhance the opportunities for the poor countries. And if the rich country didn't manage to maintain its technological or inventive vibrancy, it was likely that the poor countries would leapfrog them, and that would, alter the geopolitical position of these countries in the future. But it very much relied on the ability of the rich country to continue to be vibrant, innovative, and ingenious. That was the only recipe whereby the country could stay ahead of the others. But as Margaret said, that didn't ensure that it would be a linear progress for all eternity. There are all kinds of issues that might arise.
Now, you've had occasion to mention a couple of times Hume's special interest in, or the special value he places on what he calls the middling ranks, or the middle station in life. Would he be weighing in on contemporary income inequality?
Carl, do you want to start?
Well, so he addressed himself in particular in the essays mostly to the middling source, because he thought that the rich were too busy pursuing pleasure and the poor were too busy just trying to survive. So they were the only ones really susceptible to the type of philosophy that he was offering. But he also believed that the middling source were, in some ways, to use a Marxist term, the kind of revolutionary subject of the era. They were the ones to break down the barriers of the aristocracy and to really design society and politics and the economy in a way that capitalism could emerge and generate all of its potential benefits. He was also in the history of England suggesting, very much like Adam Smith would later do, that the aristocracy wouldn't survive in a commercial world, right? They would spend themselves into the ground, and if you're not generating any new value, any new prosperity, your time is limited. So he believed that behaviorally, the upper classes would kind of converge to the middle classes. And in terms of the poorer sorts, which he didn't really concern himself that much with, we must admit, but there's no real barriers to them joining the middle classes, or at least partaking on the edges of it, and perhaps even succeeded in making a full entry. So given that class for him was a kind of behavioral category, if you behaved like you belonged to the middle sorts, you could kind of, with time, make it into that category. But he and Hume also believed that politics would be way better off if it was managed by the middling sorts, because their wealth depended upon upholding the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure, so they would be most likely to be good caretakers of it. So he had an idea that the middling sorts was not only the kind of champions of the commercial world, but also the champions of a liberal world, and therefore that would spell good things for the rest of the population as well. So he's not, he's also, when it comes to equality, and Margaret might have more to say on this, at times he is advocating that it would be beneficial for everyone to to acquire as much of what they contribute as possible, i.e. he wanted people to be paid as much as possible. He very much viewed increasing wages as something that we should strive for as a society, in contrast to some of his contemporaries who believed in what was called the utility of poverty, that capitalism only functions if if a large enough number of people is kept poor. So he wanted the poor sorts to gain a higher standard of living, but he certainly was not an advocate of government redistribution to promote, I guess, what he would refer to as a kind of artificial equality. Margaret, do you want to add to that?
Well, I like everything you say. I just sum up that I think he is using the capitalist argument that you have to have some inequality, otherwise you lose incentives, but he definitely wants to reduce the inequality. And yes, he's a great enthusiast for high wages. He talks about the street porter having bacon and brandy now in his diet, and people wearing buttons and nice cravats and hats. I mean, he's very much a fan, if you will, of the increased consumption bundle of his day, and thinks that this should just continue.
Thanks. So I want other people to have a chance to ask questions too. There's just one last question I can't resist asking you to weigh in on briefly. And that's what you think it's a hypothetical question again. What do you think Hume would say about the contemporary discipline of economics? Would he be a proponent of the use of models? Would he be for investigating the nature of rationality? Would he be a behavioral economist? What do you think?
Well, I think we should both answer that a bit. We probably there maybe disagree. I mean, I think Hume is not enthusiastic about model building. That he likes thought experiments, but he's not so inclined to have the kind of strong hypothetical nature, if you will, of a model where every proposition, strictly speaking, is false. And in that respect, he tends to keep his economics, you might say, more grounded in the details of the actual world. But I think, if and I've read your work again lately, Don, that the emphasis that he has about the role of reason and the passions, and the reason doing the means end framing, then the passions could now be correlated, say, with preference sets. So in some sense, he might not be so disenchanted with the sort of mainstream account of human agency since, say, Paul Samuelson's axioms of rationality, the weak and the strong. So I think there's a lot of, and there are people who've worked on this, Robert Sugden and Andre Lapidus, many people have started to unpack Hume's interesting insights into the rate of time discounting. He is, I think, in many ways a behavioral economist. That's one of the things we really emphasize, is that we lose this really after Adam Smith, that we don't really get another economist after Hume and then Smith who delves so deeply into the human condition and then links that in so many rich ways with their economics. So in that respect, I think Hume is so important. And he's also very aware of cognitive dissonance, about the ways in which we forge hypocritical persona. He's very aware of how complex we are as people. And that, I think, is something, if I might say very simply, mainstream economics is rediscovering. So I think there's a great deal there in these 18th century thinkers, Mandeville, Hume, and Smith, that really bring out, just all the ways in which we are made to tick, right? Because we're just one animal after all for Hume. And yet how it then manifests itself in these complex social institutions.
Do you want to add just a sentence or two to that, Carl, before we turn to questions?
I think I'll agree with what Margaret said. We'll move on and give people.
That was a great full answer. Okay, I see there are some questions in the chat. Chad, have you been looking at these?
A number of these have been covered, at least obliquely, in some of the earlier questions. Thank you to everyone who's been typing them. They're spectacularly thoughtful. Grant had a question. Hume is known for coining the phrase, the jealousy of trade, whereby empires and states viewed their rivals with suspicion over the relative wealth and power and launched wars in the service of gaining commercial advantages with enemies. How did Hume suggest to eliminate this jealousy of trade mentality in politicians, the elimination of which was essential to promulgate measures to extend trade with rivals that would lead to the general propensity, production, civility that you're describing?
Well, I can start. Thank you, Grant, for the question. I think what Hume was trying to get statesmen and legislators around the world to recognize is that war and empire by the sword is only a temporary moment of power. It leads only to a temporary enjoyment of power. And if you really want to create a foundation for progress and even foundation for strength, geopolitical strength, you really have to look within the country. There are no shortcuts to that kind of affluence, prosperity, and power. So you'd be much better served by trying to improve industry, commerce, and creativity, and as much as possible, limiting wars and with the knowledge, recognizing that that jealousy of trade is really a sort of a base instinct and a short-term way of thinking about your relationship with other countries.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think Hume sees the gains from trade argument everywhere. He sees it not just in terms of, French wine for English wool, but or wheat, but that he thinks that skills can be transferred. And he thinks that whenever a country appropriates certain skills, say silk making, they improve upon it. Yeah. Or look at the beautiful pottery in Delft and things of that sort. So his view is that countries can really benefit by having a much richer set of channels of trade at all levels. He thinks that the mobility of the labor force is absolutely key, and that's helped to bring about a more uniform wage, which brings about uniform prices, and he speaks directly to that. So he thinks that stability of the price level and prices in wide regions also facilitates the ability to forge good economic contracts. So he's very aware of the knowledge transfers, if you will, and how we can overcome that. So, and the other thing is he shows from all the lessons of Rome or ancient or Spain, for example, that these empires always come apart. So it's really futile to try to go in that direction. No, he's wrong. I mean, Britain just starts going, full steam into its imperial efforts, but, or rather, he didn't convince anyone. Let's put it that way.
Jinji has a series of questions around Hume's new science of man idea. And the concluding question is an interesting one. Can Hume be regarded as a pioneer of modern empirical social science? And if so, how?
Carl, do you want to do that?
You can go ahead and start this one. I can come in.
Well, a lot of people have written on this already, that Hume can be seen in this. And you can see this even in his analysis of religion, that he's treating it sociologically, particularly in his natural history of religion. So I think that there is that kind of mind at work in Hume, but I think also he's very capable of the theoretical talents that he shows, the abstraction when it comes to money, for example. He climbs many rungs on the ladder of monetary abstraction. He's aware of as Carl brought out, the kind of clockwork, the interconnectedness of parts. So I think there's a lot of empirical work there, but also theoretical. So I'd hesitate to say that he's a sociologist. I would suggest that he's really thinking like an economist.
If I could just add to that, I was really struck in the book by realizing the extent to which Hume was a lifelong collector of economic data from his very earliest memoranda. And his view of the experimental method and applied to moral subjects is that we must glean up our experiments from common life rather than try to conduct experiments on people. But he was certainly gleaning up economic experiments from common life.
Graham has a question, again, in the monetary space. I'd like to hear more about Hume's thoughts on banks and bank stability. What did he think the primary causes of instability were? And did he have recommendations to stabilize them?
Thanks, Grant, for the question. So this is a topic that's been debated for a long time, and the major issue here is that after the South Sea bubble, Mississippi bubble, the kind of confidence that had been building in credit and the banking system was severely perturbed. May not have had a huge effect on the economy, but the way that people thought about the economy, there became a big controversy as to whether banks and whether private or public banks would be possible. To answer the question briefly, we argue in the book that Hume was not naive at all about the use of paper money or credit money, that something like 50% of transactions were being carried out through paper money. What he was concerned about was the backing of paper money. So if you have government debt, as in a public bank, backing the paper money, he saw that there's no finitude, there's no end to how much the government debt can balloon, and therefore there's no end to how much the quantity of money could be expanded. So he advocated private banks that had very disciplined backings of real resources like gold and silver, or very secure flows of future revenues that would secure these circulating paper bills and credit money. So it really had to do with the prudence of the bankers and the mechanisms whereby the circulating paper money was secured.
Margaret, you have anything to add there?
Well, I just say everyone was living in debt then, just like now. So, yeah. But I liked everything Carl said. I think Hume was in favor of non-monopolistic banking, and that he wanted the fractional reserve system to be done at a very low rate, so that there would be this kind of anchor, if you will, to the redeemable notes.
Brian has a question about the influence of Hume's causal views on the methodological foundations in early modern work in econ, including but not limited to Adam Smith. What is that legacy, and what does that impact look like in contemporary economics and in economics since his day?
Well, I'll try to tackle that. I'm not sure if the question is referring to one of Hume's celebrated parts of his epistemology and metaphysics that questions our ability to make causal ascriptions, that all we ever see are correlations, essentially, that events are linked again and again, and through habit and custom we come to infer that one event causes the next. But certainly in his political discourses, Hume speaks to these distinctions. So with the interest rate, he emphasizes that it's correlated with the profit rate. It's correlated with the availability of loanable funds. But what genuinely causes it to grow or lessen over time has to do with dispositions to industry, frugality, prudence, rates of time discounted, things of that sort. So he's grounding it in behavioral dispositions rather than monetary ones. But in terms of Hume's interest in causation, I think it's there all the way through. It's even there at the beginning of book 1 of the treatise with his copy principle. He's not shy of ascribing causes when it suits him, even given his really penetrating insights into the problems of going beyond the mere empirical or the mere observed to these underlying chains, if you will.
We are running short on time, so I'm going to skip to the next question, which I suspect will be our last one, and this is from Andy. I'm just going to read verbatim. Smith famously realized that while certain occupations broadened and humanized the mind, the division of labor in a factory did the opposite. It made people narrow and, quote, stupid. Hume seems to have missed this. He treats commerce as if all jobs were stimulating, exciting, and social. Would you say that's correct? And if so, why did Hume miss this or not care about it?
Thanks. Was it Andy?
Andy, yeah.
You're absolutely right that the emphasis of Hume's discussion of labor and industry is almost overwhelmingly on the professions of the middle sorts and the middle classes, but he does say at one or two places that the drudgery of the poor, the toil of the poor, is not enhancing or refining at all, and it's mere drudgery and pain. All those benefits, moral and economic, that comes from the middle class professions are not there for Hume amongst the poor. So we make a connection, and we cite the passage that you brought up from Smith in relationship to Hume's kind of dismissive, or maybe not dismissive, but his honest assessment of the type of work that the lower sorts were engaged in.
I would just add that he has a theme, the progress of reason, and I think he does believe that the working class is able to make some important decisions in their life about how many children to have, that they're able to save, and they're able to absorb new taxes. He talks about that, and they're able to recognize that there may be better paid work elsewhere, and they would at times uproot. So I think he gives them quite a lot of deliberation that is of great economic importance. So it's not as though they're just passive, entirely exploited individuals. I think there's a role there, and again, you have to tease this out, but I think it's there in Hume, and that he certainly, as Carl suggested before, are entitled to the fruits of their labor. So he does have some kind things to say about the lower orders, but you're right that the focus is mostly on the captains of industry, as we would put it.
That is going to take us to the end of our allotted time here. I want to thank Margaret and Carl for this fantastically thoughtful and elegant work. And I want to thank Don for joining us today and for stewarding this conversation. To those of you who are in attendance, thank you for your time. I know that we all have less of it right now. I would encourage you to purchase the book. It is, as I described, elegant and thoughtful and worth your time. So thank you. And I look forward to seeing all of you again, maybe in real life sometime soon.
Thank you.
Chad.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.